Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me start by introducing myself. My name is Andrew Beattie. I am the president of iPolitics Live, and it's a real pleasure to welcome everybody here this morning. We're gathered here, and I want to lay acknowledgement first that we're gathered here on traditionally unceded territory of the Algonquin people, so let me start off by saying that. And we're also here to talk about Canada's democratic infrastructure, and are we ready for the next 150 years? I'd like to start by thanking and acknowledging the support of Samara Canada for helping us present this important topic this morning. For those who are not familiar with who Samara Canada is, they're a nonpartisan organization that's dedicated to promoting civic engagement. And they do this through a series of conducting research and through educational programming across the country. So thank you very much, Samara, for their participation in helping us do this. One thing, for those who are not familiar to iPolitics Live events, we do things a little bit differently. And for those that are familiar, this will be second nature for you at this point. But I'm going to encourage everybody to pull out their second screen device. You can pull out your telephone and or your tablet right now, and we're going to be able to play along throughout the show, okay? So I'm going to encourage you to log on through a browser and just go to slido.com. And the hashtag we're going to use today is iPol Democracy 150. You can see it on the screens in front of you. So let me tell you a little bit about that while you're doing that right now. Slido, what it is, it's our audience engagement tool. So this is done not only for our in-person audience or our in-studio audience, but also for our live viewing audience as we're being broadcast right now on Facebook Live on the iPolitics page. And what we can do with Slido is you can tweet directly from it, and you can also ask questions. And this is the way that when you get to the Q&A side, how you can participate by promoting your questions and moving and asking your questions to the panelists. So, but the caveat here is that we are using modern technology. You have to do this in 160 characters or fewer, okay? So come on and log on to slido.com. You can do that right now. While those questions are being asked, you're also going to be able to see what the entire viewing audience is going to be able to participate with and ask their questions. And then you like those questions by giving them a thumbs up or a Facebook like. Those with the most likes will get elevated to the top of the queue. And when it comes time, Susan Delacourt will be asking those questions of our panelists. So let's try this route right now. So people have everybody had their devices out. Let's start with a question, and we'll just get people, we're going to get a sense of the room and sense of what our audience is feeling right now. And we're going to ask the question, you should be coming up on your screens momentarily, are we ready for the next 150 years? If you see the question coming up, it'll show you momentarily. And we're having some technical problems right now, I can see that. So we'll come back to that. You know what? What we're going to do is I'm going to ask you that question at the end of it, and I'll get that sorted out for you while we're there. There we go. So we got moved to the Twitter screen. So all of that to say, I want to, we'll come back and we're going to end that question. So you're going to hear from our panelists momentarily, and then what we're going to do, I love live. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to come back and I'll ask the question again, and then we can turn around and find out what your opinion is, and are we ready for the next 150 years. All this to say, I'd like to, before I turn it over to our moderator, I just want to acknowledge that I would like to thank, there's the question, I see it now. If people want to try it, we can do that. It should be on your screens. There, you can see how this works. And a lot of you are logging in and doing it. And we have very fascinating to see. So panelists, take note. Panelists, take note.
Tech.
So we've got a good participation, and this will come back. So we'll come back and see what the answers are like. All this to say, before I turn it over to Susan Delacourt, I would like to acknowledge that that Elizabeth May is in the audience today, Member of Parliament. There she is. Elizabeth, thank you very much, Ms. May, for joining us. We appreciate it. Ms. May is, of course, the leader of the Green Party and a proponent and a active proponent on democracy and democratic reform, and I'd like to acknowledge her today, too. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Susan Delacourt. She needs no introduction, but I will say really quickly, she's a regular columnist with iPolitics. She also writes for the Toronto Star, and of course has been a writer previously for the Globe and Mail, a veteran political journalist. Without further ado, Ms. Susan Delacourt. Susan?
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you all for coming out here this morning. I always am amazed to see people out this early in Ottawa, but I should have known, actually, on a rainy day, only Ottawa people would come out to talk about democratic reform and furiously type their votes into especially the night after a by-election, too. Although turnout wasn't great last night, I think it was below 35% in most ridings, which begs a lot of questions that we'll probably raise here today. I think it's probably a good time to be talking about democratic reform. It's, as you know, very much in the news. Samara, who is partly sponsoring this event and we'll be hearing from, is nonpartisan. But if you do have views on this issue that is in the news, certainly ask questions, and we're hoping for a lively discussion. To my left here is Jane Hilderman, Executive Director of Samara Canada, which is devoted to bettering democracy in Canada. Jessica Balduc, right? I was doing Balduc or Balduc? Balduc.
Depends on if you want to say it in French. Balduc.
Executive Director of the 4Rs Youth Movement. And we'll be hearing more about what you do, I think, very soon. And Nathan Cullen, who also needs no introduction, Member of Parliament for the NDP, and the NDP critic for democratic institutions, who spent a large part of the fall touring the country talking about democratic reform. So, and again, I also want to acknowledge the presence of Liz May in the audience. We have people in the room who have been thinking about this issue a lot this fall, and I know not confined just to politicians. So I'm hoping for an edifying and enlightening hour or so. And again, feel free to ask questions and we'll take them. I'll try to get beyond the glare of the light to see what they are. Jane, do you want to start?
Sure, that would be great. Thank you. And yes, like Susan, I love this town because you can get a room full of people at 8 a.m. to talk about democracy in Canada, which is fantastic. It's a pleasure to be here. Last week, you may know that Samara released a report called the Democracy 360. I have a copy of it here, and I know that there's some extras I think that we have if you're interested in taking a copy home. It also exists online on our website in beautiful data visualization, so please visit that. It is our second report card on Canadian democracy, and I guess it sort of begs the question, why does democracy need a report card at all? Well, there are certainly a lot of efforts to sort of benchmark democracies globally. There's, the Economist has a democracy index, Freedom House has an index. They've been going on for decades. And generally, what you find is Canada does pretty well when we hold ourselves up against the world. And that is something to take great pride in. Our democracy is an example for others to emulate. But that sort of measure doesn't always give you a sense of actually what's going on at home. It doesn't always have the sort of richness of different indicators that let you sort of see differences, from year to year, or in our case, every 2 years for our effort. So when we wanted to sort of try to, in the best way possible, find a set of things that we could start tracking over time in order to give that sort of granular idea as to, is Samara's democracy strengthening, declining, what areas can we bolster? In this report card, though, I think we can't ignore entirely the international context into which it was released. I can say, when we embarked on this journey to sort of create the 360 4 years ago, nowhere in our imaginations did we believe we would be living in a world where you're reading quite regularly about notions of authoritarianism, around sort of anti-establishment politics. In fact, generally sort of a consensus that there's a democratic recession happening around the world, where the number of flourishing democracies now is actually in decline. I think that's really important because a lot of these other countries that have been experiencing decline didn't necessarily plan for that, obviously. They didn't want to go through it. And the tipping point for that decline came a lot faster than they expected. So it's great that sort of the framing question, I think, today is not one of, what are our problems, but, how can we get ready for another 50 years, 100 years, 150 years of democracy in Canada? And certainly that's a question we ask too in the 360, in addition to sort of the data we share. We look at sort of the comparison around built infrastructure. So if you think back 50 years to 1967, there was a real imagination around investing in our sort of public space. And there were over 2,000 cultural centers, arenas, museums created across the country. And in the city, you have the legacy of, the National Arts Center, the National Library and Archives Canada. All of those buildings were created in 1967. And we tried to sort of imagine what would that sort of energy look like if it was applied to our democratic infrastructure, sort of the way we do our politics in this country. It's a lot more abstract in sort of practice, but I think there's an opportunity in this year 2017 to be that kind of imaginative and think about that strategic investment that we could make. I'll go back to the 360 briefly just to give you a sense of what's inside our report card and what we found. Despite sort of the global picture of many democracies struggling, the picture that we found in Canada was actually kind of uplifting. There isn't a sense of the sky is falling. A lot of the indicators that we've been measuring are on an upward trend, and in a sometimes unexpected way. I mean, when we look over the last 30 years, we've seen trust sort of plummeting. You've seen voter turnout consistently on that downward movement. And in 2015 in the election, we saw that reverse in a significant way. And we actually found, too, trust was upticking for MPs and parties in a sort of surprising way. So it's a nice reminder to say that, these things that we've sort of assumed will never return can return if, in fact, I think we're intentional and purposeful about it. That said, there are some, I think, areas, quote, for improvement, if you're using report card parlance. The areas that sometimes Canadians felt MPs were weakest on was their sort of ability to represent constituents rather than other interests. And indeed, they kind of question whether they have the influence that we need at all for our democracy. And this isn't a wholly new area, but it is one we kind of keep returning back to because we think kind of at the core, MPs have this really unique role as the connector between citizens and government. And so how are their roles envisioned? So we actually ask for consideration about how we can empower our MPs further. How can we bring civility, a greater level of civility back into our public discourse? How can we make sure that MPs are the very best at public consultation so that citizens have sort of an en route into our political decision making? But one other piece that we also I sort of want to leave you with to think about too, is that obviously there is some work to be done on the citizen side as well, in addition to, our elected representatives. We ask for sort of a consideration of reimagining civic education in Canada. Right now, as you know, I think if I said the word civic education, you imagine a high school teacher standing at the front of the room with a textbook open in the 3 levels of government. That is an important step in your civic education journey, but it should not be your only one. Too often in the work that we do, often working with young people, they say, that wasn't the way to reach me in terms of making sure I got what politics was about. It's about power. It's about having a voice. And so I think we need to think not only about the civic education redesign that can happen in schools, but also think reframing it as something that you're not supposed to have done by the time you get your high school diploma, that it is something that is a lifelong journey, that it is something that you continue to invest in, and that you can find sort of access to those civic education points outside of formal classrooms. So whether that be in community groups like WISE, or professional associations that sort of offer that sort of citizen kind of designation to kind of get refreshed. I think that too will help sort of return to laying down the sort of foundation, if you continue the building metaphor, so that we have, as strong as possible, a democracy that's ready for that next 150 years.
Thank you, Jane. Jessica.
Thank you. Ani Bojo, good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Bolduc, and I flew in here from Bawatin, or in English, Sault Ste. Marie. And that's my community. That's where I grew up, and it's also where my ancestors have been living for thousands of years. So it's a really special opportunity for me to be living in a place like that. and I'm part of the Batchewana First Nation, the Anishinaabeg Nation. I want to start off to say that in 2015, Indigenous people rocked the vote. There was widespread and significant First Nation participation. Some communities ran out of ballots. And with Indigenous youth as the fastest growing population in Canada today, and continuing on, we keep having babies. I've got like 6 nieces and nephews. This is an important thing for us to be thinking about when we're designing and envisioning the democracy for the future. And I think that much, as Jane had mentioned, that much of this is to be owed to education and accessibility and the work of groups like the Assembly of First Nations, Friendship Centres, and also Elections Canada to make sure that First Nations and Indigenous people were able to vote and to participate in democracy in Canada. And this is also really important to mention because up until the 60s, Indigenous people were not considered citizens in the sense that we were allowed to vote. So to think that we have gone we have come to a point in 2015 and now in 2017 that we're seeing a rise in democratic participation in Indigenous communities is really something to be paying attention to. And we made a difference. We made a difference in a lot of ridings. And the issues that are Indigenous issues are also Canadian issues. And we're seeing more that Canadians are standing beside Indigenous people to help to advance conditions in our communities as well. And I voted. I voted in federal elections. I voted in the municipal election. I'm an active citizen. I give myself maybe like a B- too. I'll rank myself up there with Canada in terms of Samara's report. But I also voted in my band council election. So I'm a Canadian citizen, but I also am a citizen of the Anishinaabeg Nation. And the governance of the Anishinaabeg Nation goes back hundreds, if not thousands of more years than the Canadian governance system. So in a time of truth and reconciliation in Canada, we are constantly hearing this nation-to-nation relationship. And we heard a land acknowledgement to begin this session with, and these are important things to think about. I'm a treaty person. I'm part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And so as part of being a treaty person, I have responsibilities to be upholding that, the relationship to the people, the relationship to the land, how we govern and work together in that area in Sault Ste. Marie and all along Lake Huron. And so I think that as we look to the future of the next 150 years, we need to be thinking about Canada as having multiple sovereignties. And this is something that I'm acknowledging in myself and that I'm seeing young Indigenous people and Indigenous nations all over the country starting to talk about. I am Anishinaabe, but I'm also Canadian, and I identify myself in this way. And so are we ready for the next 150 years? I think we could be. I think we have to have some honest conversations about what nation to nation really means. Because nation to nation doesn't just mean words. It doesn't just mean land acknowledgement. It means really thinking about what we can be doing to be building a democracy that acknowledges that sovereignty and moves forward together. And Indigenous young people are already starting to think about what this future could look like. We're using traditional governance systems as organizing models in our communities and in our organizations. And we're really using social innovation and arts-based methodologies to really combine something that I don't think is yet envisioned necessarily within the current democracy that exists in Canada. And the potential of that, the potential of unlocking the ingenuity of Indigenous young people is where democracy can go in this country. And I think that that's something to be paying attention to, as I said. And on a nation-to-nation relationship building and on a nation-to-nation basis, Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people are starting to model what that relationship looks like. And that's where we actually need to start. I work for an organization called the 4 Rs Youth Movement, and we are encouraging young people to come together to acknowledge our history in order to think about how we could be positioned in the current moment to create that possible Canada not yet imagined. one that really honors who we are and the diversity of who we are as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, knowing that that exists on both sides. And so what shifts need to be made to the democratic infrastructure to reflect nation-to-nation relationships? I'm really not sure. But I know that by supporting Indigenous leadership, by sitting and listening as allies, we can come to really understand what that possibility could be if we just open our hearts and minds to a vision for Canada that also thinks about how Indigenous nations are rising up and reclaiming that governance that's been there for thousands of years. Miigwech.
Thank you very much. Nathan.
Susan. What Jessica was just saying left me with a lot to think about, living under multiple sovereignties. It's very, very thoughtful and challenging. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here this morning. I will join the chorus with the rest and acknowledge Elizabeth May's presence, which fills me with a certain amount of fear and anxiety, because Elizabeth has learned more and probably forgotten more about democratic reform and renewal than I'll ever know. So speaking in front of her about the topics, more than just a little bit intimidating. This is, I love the use of the technology too, although my question, Nathan Cullen, why are you so dashing and good looking, is not yet. Nope, still only one like. That's disappointing. In terms of this question around democracy as infrastructure, I've been trying to wrestle with a little bit, because they're one so concrete, as you could say, and the other hard to get at in terms of satisfaction and feeling whether it's performing well. But if I think about the expectations and the change that has happened since we first came up with this democratic model for Canada, and how little it's evolved since we first came up with the way we vote, the way Parliament works, the way parties work, the way we're reported on, I'm imagining that bridge in Atlanta, I think, where suddenly it caught fire and the whole thing collapsed and everybody's standing around with engineering hats and wondering what the hell just happened. That's how a lot of my colleagues in the US Congress are feeling right now, where they're saying, we knew we were in a bit of trouble, but we didn't think the American democratic dialogue was so fraught and so broken that a disruptor could come in that wanted to disrupt not just the right-left dynamic, but the entire system, and be so successful, as Mr. Trump has been. Successful in winning. I don't mean successful in governing, because those sometimes are two different things, as he's learning. The notion, though, of what expectations are from voters right now, just the small example we have this morning, where 5 years ago, the moderator would have said, please put away all your devices and focus this way. And it would be rude to do otherwise. We now say, please engage with your devices so that we can have this conversation more broadly. Yet this somewhat ancient way of casting a vote and expressing your hope for the future has not at all kept pace with the expectations that people have of choice and of the power of their voice. Elections Manitoba did somewhat of an exit poll after their last election and asked of non-voters, of which more than 40% didn't vote, why didn't you vote? Was it the time? Did you not know enough? Do you hate politics? And the number one reason they found by far was people felt that their vote didn't count, that the exercise wasn't going to have meaning. And it's actually a logical response, especially if you've done it a few times, or in some Canadians' cases, dozens of times, where they voted municipally and federally, and they don't see any cause and effect. There's the thing that they hope for, and it just doesn't happen. So the democratic renewal, and I thought in the last campaign, the Liberals executed the conversation around democratic renewal very, very well, and put their finger on the pulse and a need that was out there, particularly among young Canadians, particularly among First Nations Canadians that I deal with, where I come from in northern BC, that they weren't being listened to from the previous government, and that a new government would come in, not just on style, but on substance different. And I thought that was done very hopefully and very well. Now, actually meeting those expectations has proven to be a challenge for the current government around some of the issues around democratic renewal, both the voting system but also within Parliament. We're currently dealing with that right now. Hopefully successfully in the end, that we don't have a arbitrary set put in. But someone told me once that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's disdain. That the disengagement that we see from voters is actually the response to having fallen out of love with this conversation. And we don't use words like love very comfortably or easily in politics, but I think, when I think of politicians who have inspired me, ones that I've been involved in or ones that are not in this country, that I've read about historically, I think it's actually a conversation about love. They hold up ideas and ideals that move me, that captivate my imagination. And I feel inspired. I feel engaged. And that's an amazing feeling. Yet when those hopes are dashed, it's a bit like a breakup. And I'm ticked off. And I don't necessarily maybe want to try again. And so in terms of our infrastructure and our democratic engagement, consultations can't be what they too often are, which is non-meaningful. Decisions have already been made, now we're going to hold a town hall and tell you that we're listening to you. And that the way that we vote matters, the way that we feel after we vote matters, and that I believe the moment when a citizen of a country goes into a ballot box and votes is a sacred moment. That's a moment where they are now alone with their power to express their will. And they can't be influenced anymore, and they can't be harangued or bullied. And that should remain a sacred moment afterwards, that it feels hopeful. So I think we need to lessen the power of the parties, the power of the party leadership. No offense, Elizabeth. She has a very divided caucus, as she will tell you, oftentimes. And she's a bit of a tyrant in the caucus, so it's understood. You have the worst boss. That if citizens have this expectation that we as elected people work for them, then we should work for them. And understand that there's always a natural tension between parties and citizens, but the balance is out of whack of the expectations for an infrastructure that needs to last us another 150 years and not collapse under a little bit of heat.
Well, I was inspired by that. I'm not afraid to say that. That was by all of you. I thought that was well worth coming out just for that. Again, ask your questions. I'm going to start it off, and I'm going to stay with the infrastructure metaphor because I think it gets at an interesting idea. There were two ways of spending money, the big infrastructure programs. One is structural, and one is cultural, sort of hardware and software. And I wanted to ask each of you whether you thought that if Canada is going to get through the next, or stay a democracy, or at least avoid what's happened down south, I will say that, are our democratic problems structural, or are they cultural? Jane, do you want to?
Sure. I'm going to take the easy answer and say it's a bit of both.
That's a journalist.
I don't think you can wholly separate the two, although I think we have a tendency to end up focusing more on the structural, on the rules, because they are sort of easier to see, given what we're talking about, sometimes an easier lever to pull on, i.e., let's change how we consult, let's change how we have free votes in the House, let's change, so, things like that. But I do think the cultural piece is so important. Like, what's the old adage, culture eats strategy for breakfast? Like, if you don't have the cultural sort of norms in place around democratic practice, you're in trouble. And I think there has been sort of an awakening that Nathan was alluding to around the world, that we sort of assumed that these values and culture would be self-renewing, that if we just had a democracy, you would automatically have norms and values that upheld it. And in fact, we're realizing, oh no, takes purpose and intention to sort of and and by intention I mean like conversations are sort of like, how are we going to do this work together? And those conversations are sometimes very hard to have, I think, in places like the Hill because of many reasons. Partisanship may be one, but also the reality of being very busy MPs. One of the other projects you may know Samara does are exit interviews with former members. They have a bit more time on their hands after they've left public life, and sometimes
Too much time on their hands. Sometimes.
and maybe can be a bit more honest. And a lot of them, recognize there's like some real problems. And when asked like, why didn't you like try to fix it when you were there? They were like, well, I already had 3 other priorities, and like those priorities were for my riding to advance. And it's hard to argue with them that they were focusing their energies entirely in the wrong direction. But you realize collectively when everybody doesn't have any focus on sort of the cultural fix, the norms, we end up kind of where we are today, or susceptible to someone who comes along and says, I'm not playing by those norms anymore. And suddenly the system is very, very vulnerable. How do we encourage those norms? It's a good question. I think for our members and our members of parliament and our parties, I think there could be some interesting conversations that could start to unfold if we have a more productive conversation about reforming how the House works. Obviously, the initial start of that conversation has not gone that well, but if you look back over time, there are cycles of these sorts of studies. It's frustrating sometimes to be on the other side of those studies and you think, oh, here we are again going through it. But those processes are fundamentally a dialogue about what kind of MPs do we want to be, what kind of workplace do we want to have, and they're important kind of educative processes to undertake to talk about it in a space that does not get to talk about it very much.
Jessica, you've...
Nathan. Nathan's biting his tongue. Okay, are you sure?
I got it.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I mean, of course I want to say yes, both, of course, yeah. And for me, I think about from a structural sense of things, it's like I've met really wonderful politicians, really well-meaning politicians who are there for the people. They're listening to you. They'll actually make time to sit down with you. But part of, I think, the shift that needs to happen within our democracy is actually how stuff gets done. So how are we aligning changes to how our political system works with the bureaucracy or the engine that actually makes these things happen? So when an idea or a change that is pushed forward by one of your members of parliament, when it gets into the bureaucracy, does that just stop? So what are the things that are creating bottlenecks within the system itself? As somebody who doesn't actually really know a lot about politics, what am I doing up here? For me, it's like sometimes I see politics as a game, and it's not a game. People's lives are at stake here. So how can we sort of find ways to really slow down and find meaning back into the work that we're doing? And I think that if people are able to sort of connect with their purpose, and lead from a place that's deep within them, then those are going to actually create systems and culture changes. We got to start sort of valuing young people's opinions and things. Like I've had different friends who are running for different kinds of politics, positions in municipal or provincial or federal, and they're told they're too young. People are not voting for them because, oh, you're too young. You're 30 years old, you run your own business, you don't know what you're doing yet. So it's like, these are the types of mindsets I think that really need to shift, and that we value intergenerational knowledge, and that we also actually strive for that within our structures, and that we have young people, old people, all sorts of kinds of mixes of people. And diversity, which was also something that was mentioned in the Samara report, that is important to be actively moving forward towards, so that we have diversity of people in there as well. I
think of 2 specific things about culture, if that's what we're talking about, and I might get in trouble for saying this, but let's find out. One is, I think party leaders shouldn't sign nomination forms. I think the nomination of somebody to run for a party is between the membership in that constituency and that person, unless they've contravened some huge heinous part of what it is to be part of that club. The second is I've read about an old British tradition where MPs, when speaking in the House, were never meant to use a speech and read or regurgitate, depending on your point of view, a speech. And if an MP tried this in the British House of Commons before, the other members in the House would start yelling at them, paper or something, until they put it down and spoke. And it's this very simple principle. If you don't know what you're talking about, why are you talking? Like, if you can't give a 10-minute speech on this bill because you don't understand the bill, and some staff person has given you a speech in which you were now going to repeat the line that your 10 previous colleagues have also repeated, it might seem small, but to me as a parliamentarian, it means a lot, because that's what the whole place is for. Yeah. So the reason why we built it, right, was to talk to each other and dialogue and debate and pull and try to come up with a better idea. I think culturally those seem important. Something Jessica said earlier, I just came back from Vancouver last night, and the day before helped raise a totem pole of a friend of mine, Jim Hart, who's a Haida carver. And he's been working for years on a reconciliation pole around residential schools. And if you haven't seen pictures of this or read the story about this thing, I'd really recommend you to it. It was one of the most remarkable events. Half of Haida Gwaii, which is in my constituency, came down to watch this pole raising, so it was this great mixture of cultures. But to do disservice to the larger story, let me just say this, that as part of traditional pole raising, you get on the rope together and you pull it up. And it's kind of tricky because this was a massive pole, and pulling it up, there's 5, 6 ropes coming to this thing. If you pull it up wrong, it goes up crooked and it can fall over. It's kind of a thing. And so you got to coordinate together, and there are thousands of people there on these ropes. And after it was raised and was set and people could let go of the ropes, you just couldn't take the smile off of people's faces. Like, to walk around that crowd afterwards, Native and non-Native people, and some hard stories had been spoken of that day, of how the government had tried to wipe out a people. And it's not done, right? There's no moment. But there's a building just down the street here called Langevin Block that was named after the designer of residential schools, and it happens to house the Prime Minister's office. And there are those of us that believe that you shouldn't honor a name and a person who designed something that tried to culturally wipe out Canada's First Nations people. I think there's still lots of cultural things we have to address and before we can fully become the country that we hope to be.
That was a good answer. All of those were good answers, actually. So in the true spirit of democracy, I'm obliged to ask the number one question.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Let me just take a picture of this, because my wife's not going to believe this was the number one question. No one's going to believe. You guys have a great sense of humor. That's all I'm going to say.
All right, so shall we just take a vote that he just is dashing and good-looking?
I think the people have spoken.
Yes,
Susan.
they have, yes. So the next question is one near and dear to my heart, actually. What connection, if any, do you see between the changing media industry and democratic engagement? Jane, do you want to?
That's a very live question right now, and obviously there's been some great work recently done. I have to give credit to the Public Policy Forum's Shattered Mirror report, which, if you haven't checked out, is such a thorough sort of assessment of where we are in Canada with its journalism. I think for one thing that taking that very big question and honing in on one aspect that I think we have to keep an eye on, and that we haven't been doing a great job of actually understanding what the decline for local media has meant. We've chatted a little bit about the fact that a lot of what used to be, you'd have like a local reporter here in Ottawa, or at least some greater capacity to put sort of a local spin on what was happening in Ottawa to your sort of regional or local paper. Either those journalists don't exist, or those papers or outlets just don't exist anymore. And I think that
There was actually a milestone in that last week. The last the last regional reporter, Winnipeg Free Press, kept a newspaper, a bureau here, and that stopped as of Friday. So, yeah.
Wow.
Well, so that's it. That's the end.
That is, yeah, a great
Yeah.
sort of illustration of that trend right now. And I think it's only what it only is managing to sort of reinforce is the us and them of the Ottawa and Parliament Hill events and the local piece. And that is I think our greatest kind of concern right now is that you do sort of slowly create a culture of ability to reject politics as something for someone else, and it's something that is totally broken, and we have to only look for leaders who are prepared to go in and sort of throw open everything. That would be if I could go back and sort of have an amazing democratic infrastructure it would be to try to reinvest in the local media.
Yeah, I'd echo that too. The Shattered Mirror report actually has some recommendations on putting local people back in. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on what's gone wrong? Is there a connection between, I don't know what the situation is like in Sault Ste. Marie. Is there a local paper still there? Or?
We even have paper boys.
Yeah. You still have paper boys?
Yeah, it's real old school up there. Yeah, no, we do have a local paper. It's the Sioux Star. But things are moving online a lot.
Yeah.
Which to the chagrin, I didn't think I'd ever say that word, but to the chagrin of my grandmother, who gets a paper, right? I think that, like, for me, I'll speak from a personal perspective, is that there's like oversaturation, and so it becomes really hard. And actually, when you're working in social justice, it actually can take a toll on your mental health. There's so much that's happening out there, and so much saturation. And it also becomes harder, as we've seen down south, for people to discern what's real and what's fake. So those are challenges I think that we're seeing. And also what I've also seen is journalists stepping up to the plate to sort of reclaim an integrity within the industry. And I think that that's a really important thing to be thinking about. So for me, it's like, is there other ways for us to get information? Is there like a slow media movement that needs to happen? I'm not really sure, but I know that it's overwhelming, I guess would be the word that I would add to around that. And so to navigate that as just a regular person can become really challenging. We're all regular people, but yeah, somebody who's not connected in the way that, say, Samara is or something like that, right?
Nathan, you see any connection between what's going on with the media and what's going on with democracy?
Maybe. I mean, there's sort of a broad room for mistrust because we can just silo ourselves entirely in only voices that reinforce our existing ideas about the world, right? Used to be you were a cat person or a dog person, and and that was enough. But now you can entirely have an ideology spit back at you, just confirming what you want to hear, which people like. And I'm conflicted in this because I know a lot of the people and consider them friends who have lost their jobs doing this incredibly important work. So it's both personal and political for me that you see the value of a Fifth Estate, you see the value of holding government to account, of exposing things that need hard work getting into, and the new media has a challenge with that. It's not as good. You ever see All the President's Men, that great film about Watergate and everything, Redford and all that? I try to imagine, even when I got into politics 13 years ago, an editor saying to two young reporters, go dig into that story for 3 or 4 months and don't produce anything. Mm-hmm. And you may never produce anything, but that's okay because it's just of value. It would never happen because of just the economic realities. So to your question, sure, but the dynamic has changed. People expect and want speed. I like the idea of slow media. Is that a thing? I hope so. Something longer than 140 characters to explain a complex issue. But the very first interview I ever gave on the Hill, I stood in front of the cameras of CBC and was supposed to explain climate change. And the producer from Toronto came on my earpiece and said, "Okay, we're hoping to use a clip for tonight's news, so give us your best 8 seconds." And I'm this new person staring at the camera trying to think of how do I boil climate change down into 8 seconds. And so I didn't get on the evening news that night. I failed. #fail. Sad.
Yeah, my story I tell, it's a good segue to the next question, is that when I was a constitutional reporter at the Globe and Mail, first of all, no beat would exist anymore for all kinds of reasons, but that my editors would get excited and put it on front page if I said, "Hey, I found somebody who has a new idea on Senate reform." And that would actually be a front page story. Yeah, huge story. So, which brings us to our next question. Do you think the Senate will show its value as a check against populism in the coming years? It's an interesting use of, I've been chided a bit lately on my use of populism because I've been using it as a synonym for some of the ugly stuff that we're seeing in the States. But actually, populism is a force for good, too, right? So, Jane, do you think, are you optimistic or pessimistic? 8 seconds about the Senate.
I'm sorry we're out of time.
I won't profess to be a true expert in the Senate, but obviously it too is in a place that you want to talk about, a place that's trying to renew itself pretty aggressively. I think it's the Senate, and for partly it's been forced upon it with such an influx of independence that the whole rule book needs to be rewritten just to accommodate their full participation as senators in the Senate. But it has, for them, opened up an occasion to study the modernization of the body and really ask some fundamental questions about its purpose. And I think it has actually tremendous potential, so much so that I think if it's going to have to figure out how to quickly be an appropriate balance against its complementary House, which is obviously elected and directly responsible to the people. Because I think the Senate is going to be increasingly a place that has a lot of ideas, has a reputation for having studied and thought about things and having experts on the benches of the Senate, and may actually. And already you're seeing that with one of the best indicators, I think, of influence in Ottawa, which is the lobbying registry. The number of lobbying meetings being registered with senators is just on a dramatic upward trajectory, which I think suggests that the Ottawa system is sort of cluing into the fact that senators are going to have a lot more say than maybe we've traditionally presumed them to have over legislation. But I think that for them, it's going to be how do you appropriately balance that influence and that power against the House? Like, when do you dig in your heels as Senate and say, we will not accept this direction? Or when does the House get to say, no, Senate, we won't take your changes or your ideas? So I think it will be a check, but it's going to be a very delicate one for us in order to make sure that we continue to have parliamentary and responsible government in Canada.
Any thoughts on Senate?
You're asking a Democrat about the Senate?
I know. Yeah,
Really?
Yeah.
I mean,
Why are you so dashing and good looking?
yeah, let's go back to that other question, but so much more hopeful. Yeah, I think there has become an equation between populism and hateful things, or the worst instincts in people, maybe.
Yeah.
I take a much more agnostic view of it. I think populism is an appeal to populist ideas that the population has, that sometimes the quote-unquote elite misses.
Yeah.
I remember Jack Layton used to go around with a debit card. You'll remember this, because we had this campaign against the banks charging you fees when you took out money. And at one point, I think we were in Sault Ste. Marie or Thunder Bay. We were in that neck of the woods, and Jack pulled out his wallet. He's like, I got to go back to Toronto to put this money in the bank. And his wallet was fat with cash. And I was like, Jack, what are you walking around with all this cash? And he's like, well, because everywhere we go, we do another media event of me going to an ATM, pulling out $60 and looking at the camera and saying, this is terrible. And I've been on the road for a week, so I've got $600 or $700 in ATM money here. And it's killing me in fees. We got to find another thing to campaign on. Yet people remember it, like people like because it was like, yeah, I've done that. So is that populist? Yes. Is it the highest order of issues? No. But does it articulate something important that people can appreciate? In terms of the Senate, I don't know. They're their own worst enemies a lot of days. I know a lot of senators. I know a lot of good senators, really incredible Canadians, smart, decent people. But as an institution, it comes down to legitimacy. Does the Senate get to a point where they say, we're so legitimate, we're pushing back your budget? Yeah. We're not voting for it. We're pushing back major legislation. We just don't like it. And are they legitimate in being able to do it? Constitutionally, sure, but in the minds of the public, most people in my region can't name a senator that's not under investigation, right? Like there's not a knowledge and association between Canadians and the Senate of legitimacy, I would argue, broadly speaking. Yeah. And that might be unfair, but I'm just sort of speaking about how people think about it. It could, I suppose, but I don't know.
Our next question is I guess, about the democracy inherent or not inherent in the Indian Act. How do we get to nation relationships under the shadow of the Indian Act, the Colonial Indian Act, or can we? Jessica, you want to take that one?
This is a yes or no question.
Yeah, 8 seconds.
Elizabeth A., what do you think?
I don't think we can. I think the version of governance and the structures which are inherent in band councils defy the traditions of normal governance. So within where I live, with the Saanich First Nations, the chiefs that I work with say, yeah, I'm an Indian Act chief. I have no legitimacy for governance within my community because we have this matrilineal society and it's very different. And so it is what it is. So I can't speak for First Nations, but I think we have to absolutely dismantle the Indian Act.
I'd be curious to know, because I've been in Ottawa a long time. I came here when I was 5. And since I got here, they've been saying they're going to get rid of the Indian Act, but that's another democratic fail, right? Why haven't we been able to get rid of it? That's maybe too big a question, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot in that question. Part of it is that I think that folks benefit from Indigenous people being under the Indian Act, and we need to first acknowledge that truth in order to start to unravel it. And we need to dig our heels into it, and that's on both sides for us as Indigenous people to really start to think about how can we create a resurgence of our own governance systems. For example, the Anishinaabeg Nation, we're an Indian Act band as well, but there's such powerful governance structures that used to exist that we could be bringing back. So I feel like it's going to be something that's going to take another 150 years to be able to unravel, but that I'm committing to it in the work that I do, and I hope that others will as well. So yes, that's part of what needs to happen in order for us to really come to a true nation-to-nation relationship, because at this point, the Canadian nation is much more privileged than Indigenous nations, and in order for us to be seen as equals, there needs to be equity. And that's what we need to build towards, I think. And just to for those of you who aren't aware, the Indian Act is something that was looked at by folks during apartheid in South Africa as well. So it's like this is a very damaging piece of legislation that exists in our country today. So.
A Haisla elder up north told me a few years ago, he said, we have and had a great governance structure around social welfare and around the environment. We just had a terrible immigration department. we didn't know who was coming, and we just said, sure, come on in.
Yeah,
and we didn't,
extreme vetting. That's what was needed.
That was the weakest part of our governance, is our immigration department just sleep at the switch.
That's fantastic. I see the screen is returned to Twitter, which means we've run out of time for questions, which is too bad because I saw there were a couple close to my heart there. I'm going to do this one in the version of a poll. The last question I saw up there was, should we return to providing, this is a hobby horse of mine, public funding to parties based on votes received. So in the audience, put up your hands if you think that we should return the public subsidy. Nice. Okay. No, I'm not supposed to have a view, but thank you. What do you guys think? quick, we have to do the CBC clip version of this.
Yes, with the agreement that there is also greater transparency around parties' expenses as well, how they choose to spend that money.
Good, yes, like that.
Oh, this is a horrible worst question for me. I'm like, I have no idea. I'll abstain from that question, but look forward to learning more what that actually would look like for me as an Indigenous person.
Yes, but not just on expenses, but also on the way that parties use data.
Yes.
Voter data is a black hole when it comes to privacy and the way that parties manipulate and handle that data. And as well, I'd throw one last thing in, which is we had a bill in Parliament to reimburse parties proportional to the diversity of the slates that they put forward.
Oh, wow.
We still rank 64th in the world for women in Parliament. We need to connect the money to parties encouraging and balancing out so that Parliament one day, sooner than 80 years, which is the current trajectory, actually looks like this country a little bit.
That is a good idea.
Yes,
New Brunswick is doing it. They just started.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
there's hope.
Yeah.
There is hope.
All right, we are ending this then on a very optimistic note. I really thank you guys for contributing thoughts so early in the morning. I learned stuff, and thank you for being here, everyone. Oh, and there's Andrew back on stage. So again, my thanks to you guys
Thanks, Susan.
especially.
Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation this morning. I'm going to take editorial license here for a second. I'm going to touch on the question that was asked earlier about democracy and journalism, and I get to sort of play, like I said, take some editorial license on this. iPolitics, as you know, has been at the forefront of providing, not only as an online source, but through this iPolitics Live initiative that we've been conducting, is a unique way of being able to engage with our audiences on a new one-on-one basis. Our whole purpose behind it is to be able to engage with you, our readers, on a regular basis. We hope you enjoyed the technology in the show, and we're going to continue to provide many more of these forums, not only in Ottawa and in Toronto and right across the country. So thank you all for your participation, and I hope that we are contributing to the democratic process as well. On that note, I do want to remind everybody that on Slido, you have the bios of all the speakers that were in for the program for today's show, so if you wanted to take a look at that, feel free. We've also uploaded the Democracy 360 report that Samara had released on March 28th. You can download that report. It's in its PDF form right now on the Slido using that hashtag. So please feel free to read it. It's a great initiative and a great report, and I'd like to thank again Samara for helping us present today's show. I just wanted to give you a quick note, and looking ahead, next week, or April 12th, we're going to be in Toronto as we're looking at participating as part of the Canadian Innovative Summit put on by the BDC, and we're going to be looking about asking the question about the involvement with universities and innovation as it can help small mid-cap companies grow and innovate going into the future. Then on May 1st, we'll be back in Ottawa as we celebrate the beginning of May, which is also, many of you may or may not know, the National Vision Month. So we're going to be looking at vision care as part of our healthcare program. I encourage you, if you have suggestions or ideas, to please put forward your questions through to myself or Todd Charlebois, who's seated at the back of the room. He's our vice president, one of our executive producers. We'd love to talk to you a little further about it. And finally, I just want to make this last comment, and this is very important. There were a ton of questions that were asked today, and I want to thank you again for asking, and I swear they're not for naught. I am giving copies of the questions not only to Samara Canada, but I'm going to give them to our two reporters that are here. We have BJ, who's in the back of the room, who covers a lot of our political functions here on the Hill. And of course, Susan Delacourt will receive a copy as well, one of our columnists. And we know that there's always a good story couched within a good question. So they're going to be exploring these and further, and hopefully you can see and read more about this on the iPolitics site. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your time. To our viewing audience, thank you for your participation. We look forward to welcoming you again in the future. Have a great day.